Good evening, everyone. I'm incredibly excited and honored to be here with you this evening in the Wittenberg Auditorium. My name is Claire Aronson, and I'm a senior in the School of Journalism and a journalism ambassador. First, I wanted to thank everyone for attending the last speaker series lecture of the fall. Tonight's event will be exciting and inspiring for student journalists like myself. With an international career spanning 35 years as an editor, reporter, and columnist, David Ignatius is truly a role model for those of us who are preparing for a career in journalism. The School of Journalism Speaker Series will continue this spring on January 27th with Robert Nicholsberg, a Time magazine photographer for 25 years who has documented conflict in countries such as Iraq, India, and Afghanistan. Mr. Nicholsberg will speak at 7 p.m. in the Ernie Pyle Hall Auditorium. Please join us for this event. Now I'd like to introduce former U.S. Representative Lee Hamilton, the director of IU Center on Congress.
Well, good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for coming. You and I often ask ourselves, I'm sure, with all of these very complex events going on in the world, where should we turn for insight and understanding? What should we read and who should we read to increase our understanding of these events? Almost any knowledgeable person would have one answer today, and that is David Ignatius. We're very fortunate to have him at Indiana University tonight and visiting this afternoon and tomorrow morning. His twice-weekly columns in the Washington Post combine superb reporting, unparalleled access to sources in the intelligence community and the national security community, and of course, first-rate analysis. For many of us, he has become required reading, and indeed, for many people around the world. Among his most recent nonfiction books, America and the World, Conversations on the Future of American Foreign Policy, in conjunction with Zbig Brzezinski and Brent Scowcroft, was a bestseller. David joined the Washington Post in 1986 as editor of Outlook section. In 1990, he became foreign editor, and in 1993, assistant managing editor for Business News. He began writing his column in 1998 and served a 3-year stint as executive editor of the International Herald Tribune in Paris. Prior to his work at the Washington Post, he was one of the Wall Street Journal's top reporters from Pittsburgh, eventually from Beirut, Lebanon. He's written 8 spy novels. I haven't read any of them. Don't take that personally, David. The last novel I read was A Day of the Jackal. That's about 50 years ago. And I'm not dead sure I read that. It could have been a movie I saw. But in any event, I'm sure they're very good spy novels. And I don't know a person who would have a better vantage point to write about spying than David Ignatius. Just to show you how old I am, I want you to know that I worked with his father, who was a very distinguished public servant, as I recall, Secretary of the Army and Assistant Secretary of Defense, but beyond that, a frequent advisor to presidents of the United States. David is a graduate of Harvard and Cambridge. He studied political theory at Harvard, economics at King's College in Cambridge. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his distinguished wife, Dr. Eve Thornburg Ignatius, and they have 3 daughters. He's received all kinds of honors, including the Legion of Honor from the French Republic, the World Press Award from the Italian Republic, Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Committee for Foreign Journalism, Gerald Loeb Award for Commentary, Edward Weinthal Special Citation, and a Diplomatic Reporting Award. He's written, of course, as you know, for the Washington Post, for the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic Monthly, Foreign Affairs, Washington Monthly, and other publications. His topic tonight is one that's going to interest me a great deal. The title is Imagining a Lee Hamilton Foreign Policy for 2013. Now, I want to say at the outset that if we had such a policy, we'd have peace and prosperity in the world. We'd have a chicken in every pot and full employment. And we would already have won the wars on cancer and terrorism and drugs. Now, David, you can fill in the details. We're delighted to have a marvelous man, a superb journalist, and a friend of mine for a good many years, David Ignatius.
Well, thank you to Lee Hamilton. The only person who could have made a nicer introduction than that is my mother. But she is 88 and in Washington, but I'm going to tell her that Lee Hamilton said nice things about her son. Thank you, Claire, for your words of welcome. Lee, I'm frankly disappointed that you haven't read any of my books. But I can help because one of them was made into a movie. And we can send you the DVD. It has Leonardo DiCaprio in it. I mean, you know, it's not The Day of the Jackal, but it's not bad. It has Russell Crowe in it. Russell Crowe, when he was making this movie, came to Washington, and I got a call one day, and a voice on the phone said, "Hello, Dave, this is Russell." And I thought it was one of my college friends making fun of me, and I said, come on, Garrett, knock it off. He said, "No, Dave, this is Russell." And he wanted to talk to me about, because every voice that he does isn't his own, because he's an Australian, about where the character in this novel came from. And I said, I don't know, I think he might be from Worcester or Springfield, Massachusetts. And Russell Crowe said, "No, he isn't. He's from Arkansas." He'd already decided. He'd been sitting there listening to tapes of this Arkansas accent. If you see the movie, you'll realize he was not 100% successful. I'm very honored and flattered to be asked to deliver this lecture. As you'll see from my remarks, Lee Hamilton is really one of the people that I study. When I think about a big problem, I literally ask myself, what would Lee Hamilton think about this? So to get ready to come see you tonight, I did try to sit and think carefully and to write out remarks. Often I'll just speak informally, but tonight I'm going to speak a little more informally, but then I'd love to take questions from the audience about whatever subjects are on your minds and have a more informal conversation with you. I want to begin by, I'm sure improbably, talking about one of my favorite country music songs. And yes, I know this is a shock to people who were used to inside the Beltway stereotypes, but we do listen to country music in Washington. And this song is called Flyover States by Jason Aldean. I see a few heads nodding, so a few people have heard of this and maybe know the lyrics. But I want to briefly quote a few to you because they're relevant to what I want to say about foreign policy and what I think is going wrong. You can hum along if you want when I say these first few lines. A couple of guys in first class on a flight from New York to Los Angeles. Man, it all looks the same. Miles and miles of back roads and highways connecting little towns with funny names. Who'd want to live down there in the middle of nowhere? They've never drove through Indiana, met the man who plowed the earth, planted the seed, busted his ass for you and me, or caught a harvest moon in Kansas. They'd understand why God made those flyover states. Now, despite that, lovely country music poetry. I don't think country music contains all human wisdom. This is a genre, after all, that includes songs with titles like I Want a Beer as Cold as My Ex-Wife's Heart. Or Her Teeth Were Stained, but Her Heart Was Pure. Or, Lee, this is one I want to play for you. I still miss you, baby, but my aim is getting better. But those titles aside, Jason Aldean's song and those lyrics reflect a truth about American political life, which is that people who live in the middle of the country, I hope not in Bloomington, but I suspect maybe so, think that the people on the two coasts who run finance, technology, communications, and government have forgotten about them. To be blunt, they think that this small group has become more rich and powerful while the ordinary man and woman has fallen behind. The breakdown of our national consensus, the devolution that we are watching of our United States into distinct enclaves of glamorous and very prosperous states and what that song calls flyover states, is in some ways our biggest national security problem. It feeds the partisanship and dysfunction of our federal government, the separation of our wars that are fought today by a professional military, not a volunteer force, from the country that has to pay for and support them. And I worry it fuels the seeming growth of isolationism and American retreat from the world. The message of the song that I read is that we are not one country. And for me, this is a genuinely worrying and dangerous problem, for it leads to a popular anger that in turn justifies a politics that we see in Washington every day and that you watch on your television sets, which is, as you can see, a politics of essentially paralysis in which the work of government, the business of government, doesn't get done. A shorthand for this period that we're in now is the Tea Party. And I wish I could say that it's as simple as a group of 40 Republican congressmen, but I know that that's not true, that there's something deeper and more worrying going on. And that makes me miss people like Lee Hamilton all the more, because for me, Lee Hamilton stands for a kind of liberality of spirit. I won't say liberalism because that's too simple, and an internationalism of the heartland, not of the coasts, but of the very bedrock of America. An embrace of the world out, you might say, from the very center of who we are as a country. So the first thing I want to do tonight is simply to salute Lee Hamilton and the tradition that he represents. Congressman Hamilton is remembered in Washington for bipartisanship. That probably would be the first thing that many people would say about him. He's remembered for civility, for reasoned debate. But to me, he's also remembered for what I would describe as the iron in his soul. His liberal internationalism was powerful because it embodied the hard lessons and values of the middle of America. It was a liberalism not of sentimentality or interest group politics, but of confidence and commitment. And that's what made it so powerful. Lee Hamilton was part of a generation that became internationalist by experience as America became a global power after World War II. Lee mentioned that my father was a part of that generation, and I'll briefly tell you my dad's story because it's a simple way of describing what I want to say about the place that our foreign policy has to begin. My dad grew up in an immigrant community in California. He made his way on scholarship to USC, where he won Phi Beta Kappa, amazingly, by sending in his assignments while working as a fireman on the Santa Fe Railroad. He attended Harvard Business School. He fought as a combat officer in the Navy in World War II, including in the greatest battle in naval history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. He came home and founded a successful company, and then he did what seemed to him the only thing that a reasonable young man would do. He wanted to serve his country, so he joined the Kennedy administration in 1961, initially in the Department of the Army, and finally as Secretary of the Navy. My dad told me years ago, and I've never forgotten it, that when he was asked to join the Kennedy administration, he was never asked which party he was a member of. He said it didn't even occur to people back then, if they wanted to get good government officials to ask you that kind of question. It would have been demeaning and embarrassing to ask. I'll conclude this brief discussion of my dad by noting that the Navy, a couple months ago, announced that it is naming a guided missile destroyer in his honor, the USS Paul Ignatius. So he's 93. I said, Pop, you really have to take good care of yourself to see this ship launch. But if you see the USS Paul Ignatius steaming along somewhere at a Navy base, now you'll know the story behind it. There wasn't a contradiction in my dad's time or Lee Hamilton's between being from the heartland, being from the bedrock, and seeing America as a global power, seeing it as an international force. In fact, that was the strength of American power, that it was rooted in the commitment that the center of the country had to this role in the world, not just to the views of the coasts that were involved in trade and were the receiving points for our immigrants. If you think of some of the framers of what people called the American century, that period that stretched from World War II to sometime before yesterday, you'll see some common characteristics. And I just want to cite a couple of these people for you so you'll think about them with me. Dwight Eisenhower, our supreme commander during World War II and then our president in the 1950s, was above all a man from the heartland. He was from Abilene, Kansas. Early in his time as Supreme Allied Commander, he wrote a letter home to his high school teacher. He was so modest, such a down-to-earth person. He said, "You probably don't remember which of the 7 Eisenhower brothers I was, but I was the 4th or the 3rd." At West Point, he began to realize his capabilities as a leader and to develop the genius for military management that he showed as commander of U.S. forces. There were always flashier generals in the U.S. Army during World War II, but none of them had Ike's rootedness, that sense of being from somewhere, of knowing who you were, that gave him an analytical clarity that everyone, but above all Churchill and Roosevelt, recognized. Richard Nixon, I put on my list, a man who was full of resentment of what we now call the blue states, really burning with it. A deeply flawed man with a chip on his shoulder about the elites in America that someone like Lee Hamilton would never have imagined. But he could also be a visionary, this man from a humble Quaker family, really from the bedrock, thought through the most remarkable reversal in American foreign policy, opening to what was then called Red China, an unimaginable thing to do. People look back and think that this was the work of Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, but if you reread the history, you'll see that this was the work of this president from the heartland, who had the courage to think that he could make big changes. Lyndon Johnson, like Nixon, was an exceedingly complicated man, but who never forgot his roots in the hill country of Texas. He came from a world that would make someone small-minded, and certainly did with a lot of his friends and neighbors, if you read his biographer. Yet he proved in his own life to be the opposite. I can't recommend highly enough, if you haven't looked at the multi-volume biography of Johnson by Robert Caro, that you do so. But the latest volume has in it a scene that I found unforgettable. I used in a column at the beginning of President Obama's second term. I suspect that column, like most of mine, went unread. But it's a week after President John F. Kennedy's assassination, and Johnson's advisors have gathered to give him advice. And the advice, almost to a person, is, Mr. President, go slow. The country doesn't trust you. You don't have the people behind you. You're from the South. You need to be careful. It was the counsel for caution and wariness. And Johnson responded with a classic American statement, which was, pounded the table and said, "What the hell's the presidency for, if not to do big things?" And he set out, literally from that first week, to do the things that President Kennedy had not been able to. He passed the tax cut bill. He passed a series of civil rights bills. 6 months after he had become president, he had managed to break the paralysis in government that, believe it or not, was as severe at that time. The gridlock in Washington was as bad then as it is now. And Johnson, in this assertion, what the hell's the presidency for, if not to be a leader, broke through it. And I can't think that will, that political force of will, wasn't part of his life as a man of the heartland, of the center of America and the American experience. I could go on with a bunch of other people. I'll name just a couple more. Dean Rusk, somebody who's always fascinated me, the Secretary of State under President Johnson, was a son of Georgia dirt farmers from a really poor background, who became an internationalist after his brilliance led him to win a Rhodes Scholarship. And he studied at Oxford and was forever changed by it. He ended up being president of the Rockefeller Foundation, as much an institution of the American elite as you could imagine. But this was a man, I interviewed him often toward the end of his life. I'll never forget him lighting Lark cigarettes. He was smoking Lark cigarettes off a pack of paper matches, the way you might at a gas station or so. Here's the former Secretary of State. Incredibly interesting, intellectually subtle man. George H.W. Bush, we think of as an Easterner, kind of son of Yale and the Ivy League. But the truth about Bush 41, as he's often known, is that he found himself. He found that iron in his soul in Texas. It was only really when he moved and connected with this America with deep roots that he began to become the person who I think will go down as one of the really fine presidents. He made ending the Cold War, extending Europe all the way east, look easy, and it wasn't. And it was a quality, it was a product of his leadership. And finally, I think of Bill Clinton. Was raised really on the edge of poverty, single mom, really difficult childhood growing up, all kinds of marks that it left on him, some of which we've seen, others we can only imagine, who came to be, fascinatingly, the president who was really the symbol of what we call globalization. This kid from a very humble background in a poor state in the middle of the country. So these were all figures, defining figures, who came out of the bedrock. This brings me back to the person that I really want to speak about and celebrate tonight, and that is Lee Hamilton. I think Lee Hamilton's greatness will be remembered especially in his ability to reset the balance in America after the traumatic events of September 11, 2001. He did that in two ways whose influence I think will be enduring. The first was through the 9/11 Commission, which he co-chaired. Their final report, which I was talking about tonight at dinner with Lee, is a work of surpassing clarity and honesty. Lee reminded me that it's the only government report ever written, so far as we could remember, that ever won the National Book Award, because it's such a powerful, compelling narrative. And that was because it told the truth about why the disastrous tragedy of September 11 had happened. It was fearless, it was blunt, it was clear-eyed, it was all the things that a very, very traumatized country needed at that time. It's interesting that two of the people who drafted that report for Lee and his co-chair, Phil Zelikow and Ben Rhodes, have shaped our foreign policy ever since for two parties. Phil Zelikow for Condoleezza Rice, for whom he was a key counselor, Ben Rhodes for President Obama, for whom he is really the closest foreign policy advisor. I would note that the person who gives the most important and sensitive advice to our president got his job through Lee Hamilton. And if you want to know the story, you're going to have to ask Lee, because I don't want to embarrass Ben Rhodes and have him stop talking to me, which would be terrible. Lee played a similar role with the Iraq Study Group, which is usually known informally as the BakerHamilton Report, which, again, told the truth about something really painful, which was the consequences of our invasion of Iraq in 2003. I have to be honest, and I say this as someone who at the time wrote in support of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, that was a genuinely catastrophic mistake for the United States to have made, whose effects we are unfortunately still suffering. And Lee Hamilton and James Baker looked that one, again, straight in the eye and said honestly that this was a failing policy. President George W. Bush responded to that honest report in his own way by deciding on a surge of troops in Iraq. One of the recommendations that Baker and Hamilton suggested as a possibility, probably not the one that they would have selected, and he found in David Petraeus a general who could make it work. And as terrible a mistake as I think the invasion of Iraq was, I do think President Bush's determination to make that surge of troops work saved thousands, probably tens of thousands of Iraqi lives. When I think about what U.S. policy can do when it really is tough and clear-headed, that's an example. So with that as a long prelude, and forgive my excursion through the heartland, I want to just briefly go to my, not briefly, but succinctly, go to my topic, which is to try to think about what a similar exercise, one like the 9/11 Commission, one like the Iraq Study Group, could do today in thinking about foreign policy. I'm going to give as my shorthand for this foreign policy study group the Hamilton Commission. I'm going to just name it after Congressman Hamilton. And I want to run through a few of the recommendations that I would want this imaginary commission that embodies the ideas of Lee Hamilton and people like him would recommend. First, it would be unsparingly honest about the problems that we have today, which it's easy to minimize or talk around. It would take account of the real reversals that the United States has experienced in recent years. As I travel the world, and I do a lot of travel overseas, what I see worries me in this particular way, that the United States at the same time is seen as arrogant and as weak. Now that's really a dangerous combination. If you think about Machiavelli's famous dictum, it's better to be feared than loved. I'm sorry to say we are neither loved nor feared today. That's one unfortunate consequence of Iraq and Afghanistan, is the world has decided we're not so powerful after all. The latest addition to this view that the world has developed of America, which comes at an especially unfortunate time, is the NSA revelations that have come from Edward Snowden's disclosures. And there is a feeling that I experienced just over the last couple of weeks traveling in Europe, that American surveillance technology was let loose, not simply on foreign citizens, but on foreign leaders. And there is a genuine sense of indignation that the private cell phone messages and calls of the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, were routinely intercepted by the United States. A modest review of this has been started by President Obama. It's a small group of experts. This is one that needs a discussion and study on the level of the commissions that Lee Hamilton co-chaired, and I hope that the administration will see that. The second thing that my imaginary Hamilton Commission would focus on, it's no surprise, is the importance of bipartisanship in foreign policy and the way in which that increasingly is disappearing. There was an old dictum that people tended to follow, which was that politics stops at the water's edge. But today, I find that even sensible internationalist senators and members of Congress, and I'll be frank and note John McCain and Lindsey Graham, two prominent senators, as examples of this, have begun to stop the movement of American policy by blocking nominations and in other ways standing against foreign policy moves that once upon a time just wouldn't have happened. One example that particularly bothers me, because I know a lot about it, is called the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. I'm almost sure nobody in this audience has heard of it, but it's a small program funded at $60 million a year in a country whose economic problems, I don't have to tell you how bad Egypt's economic problems are. And they found somebody really smart to run it, who used to run an investment bank and was willing basically to work for nothing for the last year and a half. His name is James Harmon. He was formerly head of the Export-Import Bank. And he's put together ideas that could actually get funding for Egyptian small businesses. And for the last 2 weeks, a hold has been put on this program, essentially stopping it in its tracks by Lindsey Graham for reasons that have not really been explained. I mean, this is about entrepreneurship. It's about supporting small business. It's about things you'd think that Lindsey Graham and people in South Carolina would be the first to endorse. But the program literally is on the edge of a cliff, about to die, for reasons I can't figure out. I've written about it in my column. I seem to be, as I say, the only person who even knows what the program is. But that's sad because it suggests that people are not putting the interests of the United States, which are clearly served by this program, first. That idea is, I think, the center of what Lee Hamilton has represented. And I'll cite something that he told me. I don't know if he remembers this conversation. As he was getting ready to leave as president of the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2010 and come here and spend time with you in a much nicer place than Washington, D.C., I went to interview him. And I asked him, what really bothers you as you look around at Washington today? And I'll quote what he said. The big question in politics today is what happened to the center? The centrifugal forces have become dominant. You must encourage the mindset that if you're elected, your first obligation is to see that America works. I mean, it's so obvious that that's true, that people who are elected have a first overwhelming obligation to see that the country works. And yet we have been through a series of government shutdowns, but it's basically the engine of our government shutting down because the partisan divisions, I'll say on both sides, because Democrats can be as guilty of this sometimes as Republicans, have overwhelmed the machine. So when my Hamilton Commission meets, when I get leaded to do this, I hope that they'll name names about who's stopping the machine of government. A third thing that I think this Hamiltonian exercise should do is think about how to repair our alliances and friendships abroad. That was at the top of President Obama's to-do list when he came into the Oval Office. He thought correctly that America during the Bush years, fairly or unfairly, had come to be seen as a country that just acted unilaterally without consulting friends or allies, without working through international organizations, and he was determined to change that. And I remember the enthusiasm that people had when he first came into office overseas. I pulled a cartoon from Le Monde. If you've ever seen, sometimes this French newspaper runs cartoons at the top of their front page, and right after Obama's election, they ran one practically the whole top of the front page that showed Obama on a red, white, and blue surfboard riding the waves, and it said in huge letters, "Happy New Century." That was in France, a country that had been sort of an impossible problem during the Bush years. We remember the, looking back, absurdly premature decision to award Obama the Nobel Peace Prize. He'd barely, measured the drapes in the Oval Office, and they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize. But what that said was that the world really wanted an America that would reconnect. And they had the hope that in this very brilliant young African-American president, there was a chance to do that. And part of what I am trying to say to you tonight is that as I travel the world 4 years later, I think that hope really has not been fulfilled. Indeed, we're seeing a kind of resentment against the United States build, again, that reminds me of the situation during the Bush years. Again, a lot of this has to do with these revelations about what our intelligence agencies have been doing, and I would just make two brief but emphatic recommendations, both of which, happily, I think the White House is actually thinking about. The first is to apply some kind of reasonable cost-benefit analysis to the collection of intelligence. If anybody had asked back in 2002 or whenever it was, if any possible intelligence information you could get from Angela Merkel's cell phone would be worth the potential political damage that would come from disclosure of the fact that you were doing it, anybody would have said, for gosh sakes, let's not do that. That would be crazy. And yet, that kind of cost-benefit analysis wasn't done. This collection went on willy-nilly in every direction. The motto, I think, became, if you can do it, do it. And that has to change, and I think will change. The other thought that I have, and again, I'm just coming back from being overseas and hearing people shout at me in gatherings like this because they were so upset, is some way to extend to the world, even as we have these incredibly powerful and, to me, necessary intelligence collection tools, that we will find ways to respect the privacy rights of people in friendly countries around the world in something like the way, not exactly the way, but in something like the way the Fourth Amendment respects the privacy rights of American citizens. I mean, foreigners are not American citizens, and they shouldn't expect to be treated like them, but there ought to be ways, using technology, that the privacy of people can be protected, even as the things that are necessary to try to find terrorists and others who really threaten people who live in Germany, Italy, and the United States to protect them. A fourth point I would make, and this is one that really is this week's top news story, is that it's important to support the president when he tries something really bold and transformational, as President Obama is attempting in the negotiations that are taking place now, this week. The next session is Wednesday, with Iran. These initiatives, I mean, think back on Richard Nixon's opening to China. There was a ferocious domestic lobby against that opening. And part of Nixon's courage and skill was finding a way to push ahead with what he knew was in America's interest, despite this very strong counterpressure. Obama has made a lot of mistakes in foreign policy, but this subject of Iran is one that I would say from the beginning he basically got right. When he came into office, he sent several secret letters to the supreme leader in Iran saying that he wanted a dialogue, and at the same time he began trying to form a coalition that could put together sanctions that would compel Iran to take these proposals seriously. I like to say he opened the door to dialogue, and then he found a way to push them through. And amazingly enough, these sanctions, supported by Russia and China, and again, Obama was strategic enough to find a way to bring Russia in particular into this sanctions group. Those sanctions have hit Iran hard enough that the Iranians ended up voting for a president who said, we need to turn west. That was basically Hassan Rouhani's campaign line. We need to stop thinking that China and Russia are going to save us, and we need to turn west and make the changes that are necessary. So we'll see, as I say, this is unfolding this week, and we'll see if the president can pull it off. I'm going to, because I want to leave some time for your questions, I'm going to skip over the lengthy agenda that I have for the Hamilton Commission, and I'm going to send this to the staff director, who I will nominate in my sleep tonight. And I want to conclude my to-do list with the most basic, obvious, and needed element of all, which is leadership. We as a country lived off a generation of the most brilliant foreign policy strategists certainly the world has seen in modern times, you could argue ever. People like Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Brent Scowcroft, these people had a rare genius for seeing strategy in big terms and then thinking about how to implement it. And the only, and I say that as somebody who was lucky enough, as Lee said in his introduction, to work with Brzezinski and Scowcroft on a book in 2008 in which we tried to see what did this prominent Democrat and prominent Republican agree on about where our country should go. And they agreed on almost everything. That was the interesting part. They had a clear, common vision of what was needed. It's painful to look back and see how many of the areas where the policy recommendations they made seem doable, we have in fact failed to do that. But the only sad thing about that greatest generation of foreign policy strategists is that it didn't reproduce itself. There really aren't younger versions of Kissinger or Brzezinski or Scowcroft. There are some young people who are coming up now, and two of the most promising are Lee Hamilton protégés who give me hope that we're going to rebuild that structure of people who can think about big questions and get them right. But that's really crucial. I am happy to say that in the military, which has had to fight these incredibly difficult wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the officers who succeeded with those challenges and the soldiers under them, but the ones who got through it, have skills and clarity, an understanding of dealing with different cultures, of the kind of political military aspect of policy, which is unusual. And we are going to be blessed as a country having those people as they rise in the military. For the rest, certainly the rest of my life, I think we can count on having absolutely first-rate senior officers and the men and women who came through these really difficult experiences, uncomplaining for the most part, learned from them, and will be, like the World War II generation, will have learned from this terrible adversity. And then, finally, my commission would insist on, demand, have a revolution to demand better political leadership. It happens that two of the people who embody what is best about American political leadership come from your state, Lee Hamilton and Richard Lugar. There must be something in the water here. I don't know what it is. But those two and the people who work with them are, for me, a kind of guidepost about where our country needs to go, what we ought to be rebuilding in the model of. I said to your university president today, what a wonderful thing to have a new global policy center that can work with students and faculty to try to figure out how to educate, train, empower a generation of men and women to serve the country, think of powerful ideas in the way that Lee Hamilton and Richard Lugar have. So I want to conclude my prepared remarks here again by thanking you. It's an unusual honor for somebody who lives in Washington and thinks about people like Lee Hamilton to be invited to come say what you always want to say, but in a newspaper column you only have 750 words and you can't say it anyway. So, and to thank you for in listening to me, to thank you for taking seriously this idea that I'm trying to express, that we need to rebalance, rebuild, and reconstruct the basics of our foreign policy from the center of the country outward. So thank you very much, and I'd love to take questions from the audience. Yes, ma'am. And there's a microphone, so I'm sure they will bring it to you. And I should probably tell you to introduce yourself. And I won't ask you to give your GPA.
Hello, my name is Hannah, and I'm a freshman in the School of Journalism. You talked about devolution being one of the biggest threats to national security, one of the biggest national security problems. How can our generation of journalists strive for less polarized coverage of the news?
It's a wonderful question. I assume everybody heard it. It's one that's really close to my heart. The question is, how can younger journalists fight the polarization, partisanship, gridlock, dysfunction? And I would give a simple answer to that, which is that there are media organizations in the United States that exist basically to tell you that what you already think is correct, that all the people you think are terrible, and here's stories that are going to prove it, and all of the people you think are great are really wonderful. And you know what those organizations are, and you know that increasingly on the internet, the blogs that are successful are those that reinforce your beliefs rather than challenging them. And you know the basics of journalism. When I got started too long ago, and now when you're getting started, are being independent of any preordained, assumptions about who's right and wrong, and being fair. I said it in a journalism class today, and I'll repeat it. Forgive me if you've already heard me say this. It's impossible to be objective. I mean, objectivity just doesn't exist in a subjective world. But it's easy to be fair. For a journalist, being fair means if I write a story that says David Ignatius is a terrible person, before I publish it, I'll call David Ignatius and ask him what he thinks. And you would be amazed at how often that simple rule is violated. As I told the class today, every time you read in a story the statement, so-and-so couldn't be reached for comment, baloney. Anybody can be reached for comment if you try hard enough. It's just people, that basic habit of fairness, I think increasingly is disappearing. So, there are news organizations that are independent and I think strive to be fair. I'm lucky to work for one, but there are a lot of them, and I hope there'll be a lot more, because as the world gets more complicated, people need to know what to think. They need information they can trust. And the people who supply that, the journalism graduates of IU or whatever, the people who can supply that and give trustworthy, believable information are going to have a great future. Yes?
I know it wasn't your thesis that just coming from the Midwest guarantees you success and wisdom, but I want to ask you about Barack Obama. He is as much a Chicagoan as anything else. I think that's where he spent the largest single share of his life. It's where he came of age politically, where he taught, where he was elected to office. Are there things about his Chicagoan connection and his Midwesternness that you think have contributed either to successes or to failures, or both, that are attributable to his service in government and his growing up in the Midwest, in Chicago?
Barack Obama has many gifts, and I think like a lot of people, I hope that he would be a great president, because I think the country needs one. I would say honestly that on the basis of the first 5 years almost, he has not been. He has not been able to break through the problems that the country has. He did have clarity about our foreign policy problems, with the exception of Iran and a few other things. I think he's mostly been overwhelmed. I think one of his problems is in fact that he doesn't have that sense of rootedness and centeredness. I mean, if you read his remarkable autobiography, Dreams from My Father, he is to a large extent a self-created, self-imagined, self-defined man, not defined by, where he grew up, those roots, but a young man who, from a absent father, living all over the world, who had to decide his identity, racial, intellectual, and it's a remarkable story, and because he's a brilliant person, the product is powerful. I've written a number of times, so I'll repeat here that it's interesting that this man, I just don't think Barack Obama is in love with politics in the way that a Johnson or a Clinton or even an Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a very political guy. Obama, interestingly, functions at his best in secret. I've written that he has been a great covert commander-in-chief. The decision to go after bin Laden in Abbottabad was tough-minded. Yeah, it was that talk about bold presidential military leadership, that was worthy of Lincoln. He pulled it off against strong advice from some of his key advisors not to do it. I have a lot of concerns about drone warfare, as you'll see if you read my last book, but I do think President Obama, in secret, used that instrument to destroy the core of al-Qaeda, and for a country that, we know what they did to us. So, but those things were done in secret. The public side, interestingly, curiously, has been harder for him. And, I would not. It's interesting when you said, well, he's a man of Chicago. That's not how I think of him. I guess I think of him as a man of Hawaii, a man of Punahou, a man of his boyhood in Indonesia, a man of Harvard Law School, not the streets of Chicago. Yes.
Hi, my name is Kevin. I'm a freshman in majoring in journalism, and I heard you mention Edward Snowden. Now, I think there's a lot of differing views in the media over whether he's a patriot or a traitor or a patriot traitor. And do you think that he's wrong for doing what he's doing, or he's doing right in the wrong way?
I guess the way I would put this is that the consequences of what he did may end up being good for the country in some ways. But what he did was systematically violate what he promised he would do, which is protect very sensitive information. The strange thing about these programs is that they were legal. As we look at more of the details, I think all of us have questions about whether the programs went too far. But they were passed by Congress, they were reviewed by Congress, by the intelligence committees and members who wanted to know more. They were reviewed by a court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which I had thought was just a patsy and a phony, but it turns out wasn't. I mean, in 2011, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court issued an order saying what NSA is doing is illegal. It is violating the law that was passed, and it must stop. And so that court forced the NSA to change its procedures. I just have written a novel, my 9th novel. I finished it 2 weeks ago, which is all about these issues. It has characters a little like Snowden, and so I've been, ruminating on this with the luxury a novelist has of not having to give quick yes or no answers. But I think two points I conclude with. There's no question that he broke the law, and it's very hard to justify that. There's no question that the stories using the material that he provided have changed things probably for the better. I spend time in really crazy places. I've just come back from Lebanon, and I've traveled in Syria with the Syrian rebels. I mean, there's a big problem that's developing. Al-Qaeda is really putting down deep roots in Syria and again in Iraq. They're at the shores of the Mediterranean now, and the threat is less to us, I think, than to Europe. But the ways in which how are you gonna know if somebody, in the Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Aleppo or over the border in Antakya in Turkey, is calling a cell that's been established in Germany or in Italy or in France? It's not going to be possible without the kinds of tools that have been revealed. And it worries me. I think people need to think carefully about the threat that's coming, and if the ways that we've been dealing with it are not appropriate, what are the right ways? Yes.
My name's Ryan Myers. I'm a junior majoring in speech writing through the Individualized Major Program. Last month, I was fortunate enough to hear Congressman Hamilton speak a bit on the Iran negotiations, and one of the challenges he mentioned was that the media is setting really high expectations for how these negotiations should go. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit to what the role of the media and the challenges of journalists as expectation setters of foreign policies are.
Well, that's another good question. First, on the particulars of the negotiations, as a journalist, I have tried to, because I believe that some diplomatic resolution of the Iran nuclear problem is very much in the interest of the United States and Israel. I don't think another military action in that part of the world is a good thing. I've tried to, put as much detail on the record as I could over the last few years. I've been to Iran. I've talked with Iranians there. I meet with their leaders in New York. I had the only interview one-on-one with President Rouhani when he was in New York for the General Assembly. I try to push him about the details. And from what I know about the agreement that is the U.S. is pushing for, that the Iranians have not yet said yes to, if they say yes Wednesday or a week later, it's not a perfect deal, but it's a deal that will make the world safer for everybody. But I would put at the top of that list Israel. So I think it's a process worth taking seriously. Yes, ma'am. In the red jacket. But hold on, wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Neha Ramani, and I'm a freshman. You mentioned Senator
I'm
Lugar.
glad that so many freshmen have turned out for this. I know you should be doing your homework. But.
Well, you mentioned Senator Lugar as an example of a good political leader, but considering that many people believe that it was his moderate views that caused him to lose his the Republican primary to Murdoch, what do you suggest to aspiring politicians who want to be bipartisan but also achieve their political goals?
Warren Buffett, one of my heroes, the genius investor, often says that at any point in American history, you would have made a mistake betting against America's ability to solve problems. Meaning, you would have made a mistake betting that America will remain paralyzed, that that moderate views in the end won't prevail, that we won't find a way out of our government difficulties. It is true that for the moment, it's tough to be Senator Lugar or name your moderate. Because I was interested in the kind of technical politics of this, at the time when the government shutdown was, we were still on the edge of the cliff, or I guess just after that, when they'd folded their hand. I talked to David Plouffe, who is President Obama's top political strategy and really, a modern political genius. Plouffe understood that this last election, 2012 election, was not an election about 50 states. It was an election about 8 states. And he found tools, very modern tools to identify who Obama's vote was, whether they had voted in recent elections, what the best way to appeal to them was, and then he put tools in the hands of organizers to go door to door. So I asked Plouffe, what would you do if I said to you, how do you defeat the Tea Party? And he said, this is actually not an impossible problem. It's all about turnout. I mean, that's what Plouffe understands about politics is that even in primaries in states that have closed primaries, where you only somebody registered in the party can vote in them, if you can identify using these modern tools who can vote, and then reach the people who will vote for more moderate candidates, there's no reason to assume that. The numbers say that the people who have very extreme views are a pretty small minority, even in the Republican Party. And yet we assume that they have a permanent lock on things, that with redistricting they'll keep winning and winning and winning. And the point that the people who really understand technical politics say is that's not true. If you need good candidates, you need money, and you need tools that, frankly, Republican moderates have been slow to adopt. They need to take a page from David Plouffe's book. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So you get to be the last questioner.
Oh, what an honor. Okay, my name's Kate O'Rourke. I'm also a freshman here. I'm curious to know who or what has influenced your journalism career the most?
Well, my boss for many years, Ben Bradley, will receive the Medal of Freedom on Wednesday. So I just note, if Bradley was here, he'd roll his eyes and say, "Give me a break," But he certainly did. I think I'll give a sort of weird answer. What influenced my journalism career from the beginning and keeps reawakening it is the experience of doing journalism. I told the class today, my first assignment coming out of private school, then Harvard, then Cambridge University in England, my first assignment was covering the Steelworkers Union in Pittsburgh. I mean, can you imagine anybody less naturally suited to this than, and I had to learn how to talk to people who were not like me. And I had to learn how to make sources. I had to learn how to just get out of my skin and into the so I could talk to people and listen to people and learn what they had to say. And I am still in this business, at 63, because I still get excited about that. I've just come back from a trip where, I wanted to know, what does Egypt think about what's going on? What's the truth about Egypt? What should I tell people about Egypt? And so I went to a village in the Nile Delta, and I arranged to talk to a bunch of simple villagers there and ask them, what's happened to you in the last year? Walk me through it. And I found, brave people who just told me the truth. A year ago, I was driving me nuts. I have to write a column twice a week. I needed to write about Syria, and I didn't know what to say. So I went to Syria. I got smuggled in by the rebels. It was a completely foolhardy thing. I went to Aleppo in the middle of the siege, middle of shell fire. I mean, it's not something my wife practically shot me. What I learned, what gets me going is actually doing it, and that's what I'd say. I'm sure there are a lot of journalism students here. It's the experience of doing it. It's taking the risk, getting out of yourself, listening to people, telling the truth, putting the truth in the paper or online. That's where it's at. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that stimulating and interesting talk, an informative one. Before you leave, we do want to give you a plaque recognizing you as the 2013 Lee H. Hamilton Public Service Fellowship Award in recognition of your exceptional service and dedication to journalism, Indiana University Institute for Advanced Study in the Center of Congress. So thank you very much, and congratulations.